Welcome to this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. My name is Daniel Murphy and I am Assistant Editor of the Journal. If you are new to these podcasts, please visit the Florida Historical Quarterly on Facebook, where you can now access abstracts of each article in the current issue of the Journal. In 2017, the FHQ is completing its publication of a series of 6 special issues in recognition of the quincentennial of Ponce de Leon's first visit to Florida in 1513. Our next special issue, covering Florida history during the 20th century, will be guest edited by Gary Mormino, Emeritus Professor of History at the University of South Florida at St. Petersburg. Please look forward to publication of this issue in 2017. Today's podcast features an interview with Kathryn Palmer, Archives Historian for the State Archives of Florida. In the interview, Kathryn and Dr. Robert Cassanello discuss her article titled Losing Lincoln, Black Educators, Historical Memory, and the Desegregation of Lincoln High School in Gainesville, Florida, which was published in the summer 2016 issue of the Florida Historical Quarterly. Please note that this interview is a bit shorter in length than usual due to technical problems in the recording process.
Kathryn, I want to thank you for joining us today on the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast. And if you could, do you mind introducing yourself to our audience?
Sure. My name is Kathryn Palmer, and I am an instructor of history at Tallahassee Community College, and I'm also the archives historian at the State Archives of Florida. I have a master's degree as well as a bachelor's degree in history from Florida State University.
Okay, and so I'm fascinated that you're at the State Archives, but some of our listeners might not know where and what that is. So what does the State Archives exactly house, and what do you do there?
Right. So the State Archives was established in 1969 by a legislative statute, and it exists with the intention of, or the mission rather, of collecting the documents of the state government of Florida. So we collect a lot of the documents of the executive branch. We have governor's papers dating back to the territorial period, and then we also do have a pretty sizable collection of legislative records. So from House and Senate committees, you can go back and look at how different bills were passed or proposed. And then also, that is the bulk of our collections, but we also do have some pretty extensive manuscript collections, so like family papers, personal items that speak to the experience of Floridians.
Sure, and so you're located in Tallahassee, and the reason that we're talking today is about your article on a black high school in Gainesville. How'd you get interested in this topic?
All right, well, I've been interested in the topic of education since I can remember. Education has always fascinated me because I think it's unlike something like, it's not measurable necessarily, like, or quantifiable in terms of dollar amounts, or like what I'm trying to say is no one can take away your education. Like, I've always seen it as probably the most empowering tool that our country offers, public education, that everyone should have an opportunity to really take a deep dive into things that interest them, and that education can empower you to change things in your life and for others. So I got interested in researching the topic of education when I was in college at FSU. I was a history major. So I started just researching the history of public education in Florida, and then I realized, well, it's pretty much impossible to study education, especially in the South, without studying race, because it's everything. They intersect at every moment in the history of education in Florida. You've got the subject of segregation or desegregation, and I think my earlier point about how education is such an empowering tool, that fits in so well with the study of race and education in Florida. So that's how I really got interested in studying school desegregation, which is, the Brown versus Board of Education decision is something that was meant to empower blacks, but after segregation. But as you start studying it more, you see that there's a lot more to it, that it didn't necessarily always work out that way.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I actually gave a copy of your article. I gave the issue to a colleague of mine here at the University of Central Florida who had been, she was doing some research into Jones High, which is the local black high school here, has a similar sort of history to Lincoln High. And she walked away with, I mean, first of all, she loved the article, but the second thing she said, she goes, I can't believe because, we grow up, and she's a white professor, and she says, we grow up and we're kind of understand that racial segregation was this awful thing, but you're kind of left with this melancholy because it kind of really does have this destructive integration has this kind of destructive aspect to, a lot of parts of what had been a holistic black community. And she's really kind of struggled with it. And I said, I think, that kind of what makes a really great article is something that you read and you really kind of struggle with afterward. And so I mean, did you kind of set out to say, I really kind of want to look at this in very kind of critical and complex ways?
Oh, definitely. I just to the point that you said your colleague made, like you grow up and like I grew up a few generations after Brown versus Board of Education in public schools in Florida, and I grow up knowing that around me schools are segregated. Even if there's blacks and whites going to the same public school, they're segregated within the classrooms, and that's evident. But it's kind of like the problem we all live with, but no one talks about. So I just came away from a public education experience in Florida wondering, like, why are we in history classes talking about the civil rights movement like it ended everything, like it ended inequality in education, when in the same classroom the teachers are discussing that. Look around you and you'll see that there's only white kids in this classroom, or there's only black kids in this classroom, that it's still very much segregated. So that was something that interested me, like, how can that be? Because when you're taught about the civil rights movement and school desegregation in high school, at least, it's a little different in college. They obviously take a much deeper approach, but in high school they talk about like everything was rectified. But we live in the world around us, and if you open your eyes a little bit, it's pretty obvious that didn't happen. So that's what I really set out to do in researching the topic of school desegregation in Florida. Like, let's scratch the surface a little bit deeper on what really did happen after Brown versus Board of Education, and why has that failed to very clearly equalize educational opportunity for African Americans.
Sure. It's sort of interesting because, when I was in graduate school, I don't mean to sound like I'm walking in the snow 20 miles or anything like that, but
right.
that was the end of this kind of first generation of civil rights history. And when I entered into graduate school, and of course I was interested in civil rights and ended up writing and researching about civil rights, but there were sort of two ways to go, because people had really mined the 1950s and 60s a great deal, right? Like, all that stuff had really kind of been done and done really well, and there wasn't really kind of new avenues for young emerging scholars. So people started to go back, like, to the progressive era and the early 20th century to kind of look at that long history that people have written about at the end of the 1990s and early 2000s. And a whole other group of people, as I think you encapsulate this really well, started to go past the 1960s into the 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s to say, here's the civil rights story. We think it kind of ends when Martin Luther King dies, but it really doesn't. And there's this really kind of complicated, difficult history as well after the 1960s. And I think, you just explaining that really kind of encapsulates that so well. And I'm wondering, do you get, because, I think, like, with my colleague who is a little bit unsettled by your piece, do you get a sense that people don't want to confront civil rights unless it's this kind of monumental celebratory that ends up in, we all kind of integrate, we all sort of sing Kumbaya in a way?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So what you just said reminded me of something that, we kind of like to hold on to this narrative that it all ended when Martin Luther King died. Everything was settled by the late 60s. But a year before Martin Luther King died, he said he's looking at the situation of integration, seeing how it's playing out, over a decade after Brown, and he says, we want to be integrated into power. We don't want to be integrated out of power. This is the sentiment that he's got a year before he's dead. So a year before he was assassinated, excuse me. So I don't think that he had any kind of false idea that things had been rectified or justified by any means. And the story of Lincoln High School is so interesting because the white-controlled school board of Alachua County, where Gainesville is located, did vote to close Lincoln High School, which was a very well-known black high school in Florida. There were a lot of really great teachers there, and it was really above average as far as the academic curriculum that it had to offer for blacks in Florida. But when it closed, the community was so upset, and because the school board wanted to close it and reopen it as a vocational school, which they kind of took as an insult, and rightfully so. But this sparked kind of a new movement that fit into what was happening with the rise of the Black Power movement in the late 1960s and early 70s. So we see here like a big shift in the aims of the civil rights movement. So what you said, the work that's been done on the 1950s and 60s, that's really focused on the struggle to get legislative action for civil rights. So a lot of those works culminate with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And while those were like very powerful pieces of legislation, which enfranchised a lot of African Americans and did propel the school desegregation movement forward, this new struggle with in the late 60s and 70s after this was about maintaining black culture within this new integrated society. And that struggle is just something that is much more difficult to quantify because you don't have the kind of monumental pieces of legislation that you can point to like you could earlier. But this is a struggle that continues today. And I think that's pretty evident in a lot of recent current events. We look at, symbols of like the issue over the Confederate flag. That's kind of an issue over cultural representation. What does that mean for our history? What kind of history are we trying to present as a state and as a nation? And this is a lot of what Lincoln struggled with when it closed. It was the question really became, how are we going to preserve our history so that the perspective of the people that went to Lincoln High School and taught at Lincoln High School is preserved and it doesn't get overwhelmed by this prevailing narrative that even though it closed, everything was fine and everyone now has access to equal education, because let's look around us and we know that's just not true today. So maintaining black cultural representation in an integrated world became very much the new struggle after that classic civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s.
Sure. And there's another piece within your article, too, where you look at memory and the way in which the high school is remembered. And can you talk a little bit about why that became so important to your analysis?
It became so important because the prevailing thought on the memory of school desegregation in Florida is pretty positive, because Florida was, when the Brown versus Board of Education decision really started to unravel in the 50s. In the late 1950s, the governor of Florida, Leroy Collins, was a known anti-extremist. He was very much against any kind of bold action or defiance of the Supreme Court, and he actually went on to work in the federal government with the Community Relations Service, which was a pretty well-known civil rights mediation group in the 1960s. But his experience, Governor Leroy Collins, is very unique. The rest of the Florida legislature, or the majority, I should say, was very much against defying the Supreme Court's order, but that defiance that existed throughout the Florida legislature is often overshadowed by Leroy Collins' moderate attitude. So that's how Florida is remembered in the civil rights movement on a larger scale, is that it had a moderate reaction to it. After Lincoln High School closed in 1970, there was an initiative between some former teachers at Lincoln and then a professor at the University of Florida's College of Education. They got together and undertook a project called the Lincoln High School History Project, in which they interviewed and did a lot of research on Lincoln High School as it existed during Jim Crow and during school desegregation in the 1950s and 60s. So they're able to preserve these memories. And now I'm able to, as a historian, I'm able to compare the prevailing memory of Florida as a moderate civil rights state, as a state that reacted moderately to the integration order, with this other narrative from the Black community in Gainesville that says a lot of competing things with the prevailing narrative. So looking at those two different perspectives kind of helps balance out what the real story was.
Sure. I kind of can relate with this because the high school that I mentioned earlier to you here in Orlando, Jones High School, actually created, along the same lines as what you're talking about, created a history museum at the high school for the historically Black high school. And so there is a constant engagement with the memory of the high school and the meaning of not only the high school in its history of segregation, but the high school in its history of integration as well. It's not necessarily as positive as one might think, and along the ways that you're describing in Lincoln High School. Are there still efforts in Gainesville on the part of African Americans to sort of commemorate this history in interesting ways?
Yes, there are. So there's the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. This is a pretty well-established program, and they continue to seek out members of the African American community in Gainesville to capture their memories of segregation, of integration, of life even after integration. And what comes up over and over in those interviews is Lincoln High School, and how important Lincoln High School was and still really is to the Black community. And the people that came out of Lincoln High School, you've got a lot of judges, lawyers, doctors, people that are like pillars of the community in Gainesville and then the larger Florida national stage. So Lincoln High School is still very much a part of the memory of the African American community. In fact, in 2012, the president of the Lincoln High School Alumni Association wrote a book about the history of Lincoln High School. The daughter of Thomas Wright, who was the leader of the local NAACP in the 1960s and actually filed suit against Alachua County over school desegregation. His daughter wrote a book about her memories of that experience, I think in 2012 as well. So there's still been a lot written about Lincoln High School. You can look in the Gainesville Sun, the local newspaper, and within the past few years, there's been articles written about how important Lincoln High School was to the Black community during school desegregation, about how now the Black community suffers by not having as many Black teachers in classrooms in Alachua County, and how having Black teachers as role models at Lincoln High School was such a boon to the Black community during that time. So there are ongoing efforts to preserve Lincoln High School and its history. I believe that the old Lincoln High School building was recently added to the National Register of Historic Places, and I think the same is in the works for Aquin Jones, who was the principal at Lincoln during Jim Crow for several years. I think his house is also going to be preserved in a similar manner.
Great. Here's the last thing I want to ask you, and I'm certain that once our subscribers hear this interview and hear the history that you've been researching, they're going to come seek your article out. But I think they're also going to be interested in what's next for you. So what's next? What's the next project that you're working on, or where can we hear you next?
Well, I stay pretty busy with the job as the archives historian at the State Archives, to be honest. But something that's been that I did not get to explore as in this article, because it kind of went beyond the scope. You got to stop your research somewhere. But something that really stood out to me that I would love to research more is the representation of Black history in school textbooks before and after Brown versus Board of Education. So basically the idea here is that I wonder if during Jim Crow, when Black educators kind of had the control over what students were learning in their classrooms, how did they represent Black history and African Americans in American history? Because I know that after school integration came, Black history is really reduced to being discussed in the month of February, and even there, schools don't necessarily do as great of a job as they could with filling in the big picture that African Americans have been present, just like whites, in every era of our country's history. So I really wonder how that has changed over the years and what implications that has for the empowerment of Black students and what is the difference really between a Black student who's sitting in a classroom where they're hearing history about how African Americans have positively contributed to our country's development versus a Black student who's sitting in a classroom that doesn't ever hear anything about how African Americans have contributed to our country's development. And instead, they might just hear stories about what certain white men and maybe a few white women have done, and might not feel like they're really a part of this history. So I wonder about the preservation of Black history and how that translates into classrooms before and after Brown versus Board of Education.
Well, that sounds interesting. I mean, it almost seems like you're going back to the Brown v. Board question in some way, at least putting it in the history
Brown
context.
versus Board is such a throughout this whole project, it's just very clearly stood out as the axis of this whole history, because it did change so much, and it opens doors to ask questions about the relationship between the state and federal government, and how that's different for African Americans and whites. So I always like to go kind of start at 1954 and go on either side of that and see what the difference is, because that was such a big change in our country's history that we're really still living the aftermath of Brown today.
Sure. Well, thank you again for talking to us today.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Thank you for joining our international audience for this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. The Florida Historical Quarterly is the peer-reviewed scholarly journal of the Florida Historical Society. The Society was founded in 1856 and is the only statewide historical organization in the state of Florida. The Society is headquartered in Cocoa, Florida, and the editorial offices of the journal are in the Department of History at the University of Central Florida. I hope you have enjoyed the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast and that you will consider supporting future scholarship on Florida history by becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society. We also invite researchers to access back issues of the Florida Historical Quarterly on JSTOR. Thank you again for listening to the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast. If you enjoy listening to this interview and know of others who enjoy history, please tell them about the podcast and have them find us on Facebook.